Hi, this is Sam Torode.
You're listening to Wisdom for the Rest of Us, a journey in search of wisdom that we can all use in our daily lives. I'm E.T. Hansen, but you can call me Eric.
I'm really happy to have Sam Torode with me today in my little podcast. And we're going to start the interview, start the discussion with a big question. What is the meaning of life? I hope he has a good answer for us. Sam Torode is an expert on Emerson. He's not an academic expert. He's a journalist and a writer who thinks a lot and talks about and writes books about Emerson. And that's why I wanted him on the show. Sam Torode is a podcaster. He has a podcast called Living from the Soul. It's very good. You should check it out. He does interviews with interesting people every week or several times a month. He's written a book called Living from the Soul, The 7 Spiritual Principles of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's looked at the philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet and philosopher, and he's taken 7 principles of living and put that into a book. It's a good book. You should buy it. You should read it. It's fairly short. It's well written, and it has a lot to do with real life, our real life. So I'm going to talk to him about that book. I'm going to talk to him about Emerson. I'm going to ask him what transcendentalism is. That's Emerson's philosophy. Sam does a lot of other things. He makes music. We'll talk about that stuff too. And so I hope you enjoy the interview. Thank you, Sam. Thanks for coming. I'm glad you're here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Let me start with the big question. I want you to answer all my problems, all my questions that I have. What is the meaning of life?
Oh my, that's quite a question to start with. I was thinking, since we're here to discuss Ralph Waldo Emerson, I was actually wondering if he would even think in those terms of asking the question, does life have a meaning? I think meaning is about information and rational thought. And I think that Emerson was more about the experience of the mystery of life, and that perhaps because we're modern people, we're caught up in the information aspect of things, and we want, just give me the one sentence meaning. What does it mean? But really, something like life can't be condensed into a meaning.
Can you tell me about what do you mean, or what does he mean as far as you can tell by the mystery of life? You say the mystery of life, which is really fascinating. What do you mean by that?
Well, Emerson and I too were fascinated with the mind and the spirit as being the forces behind the material world and what we experience in this life. And when it comes to the mind and the spirit, these things, we can't really experience them directly. The classic example is that you can't think about thought, or when you're thinking about thought, it's a meta thing. You can't directly get there. And when it comes to examining the mental and spiritual worlds, it's really a mystery that's beyond our human capabilities.
But if it's beyond our capabilities, why make the effort? Is it important at all? The spiritual side of life, if it's not graspable?
Yeah, and what Emerson points out to us is that it's available through analogy. So I shouldn't say that we can't experience it, but rather we experience these things, we learn about them through analogy. And Emerson believed that everything in the physical world is actually an analogy, a picture, an expression of something in the mental or spiritual realm.
But what does that give us? What does it do for us? If I could, there are 2 ways of going through life. Well, there are many ways of going through life, but I could imagine going through life just kind of like an animal, just living, just eating, sleeping, having sex, dying, and not worrying about life. Or I can imagine going through life as a human being where we're constantly thinking about it. We're thinking about spiritual aspects. We're looking for God or whatever. Why is one better for us than the other?
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, because I think in Emerson we find an endorsement of both ways of living. He really loved nature and saw a lot of value, for example, in the way animals do live without worrying so much. They simply live and are taken care of. when a bird sings, they don't worry, oh, am I going to sound good or am I going to be off key? And Walt Whitman, who of course was deeply influenced by Emerson, he wrote in Leaves of Grass, he writes, "Oh, I wish I could live as the animals do. They don't feel guilty about the past. They don't worry about the future. They don't bow down worshiping one of their kind who lived centuries ago." So I think on the one hand, yes, Emerson would say we should be more natural and in tune with nature and not caught up so much in our thoughts. But on the other hand, he, of course, was very contemplative. He loved to study, to read, and to write. So definitely contemplative, but without getting so caught up in worrying and guilt and anxiety and such.
Let's talk about you a little bit. Tell our listeners who you are, actually. You are well, you do a lot of things. You do music. You're a podcaster. Your podcast, let's make it clear what that is. It's called Living from the Soul. And every week you interview people on this kind of subjects, on living, how to live, philosophy, and it's on Spotify. And then you have you write books, quite a number of books about philosophy, where you look at philosophers and you think about them and you write your thoughts on them. You paraphrase their thoughts about philosophy. And one of these books, which impressed me a lot, it's really good, is called Living from the Soul, The 7 Spiritual Principles of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Is that right?
Thank you. That's my favorite of the books I've done, and that's why I named the podcast after it.
Okay, it's recommendable. I recommend it. There's an audiobook version, there's a Kindle book version, there's a print version. I recommend that book. Can you tell me a little bit why you seem, a lot of your life seems to be centered around understanding these philosophers. Can you tell me why that is?
First off, I'll say I am a jack of all trades in a sense. I've never wanted to be pinned down in one area. As a kid, I loved artwork, and in high school I expected to become an illustrator and artist. That was my goal. Then as I got into college and beyond, I shifted more into writing, partly because I'm very slow as a visual artist and perfectionistic. So I found things were easier in the world of writing. And also I could delve into ideas because I'm always thinking about concepts and ideas, have a love of that. And as far as how I got into these philosophers, part of it would be I grew up in the fundamentalist Christian church, and we thought we had all the answers, and they were right there in the Bible. You simply had to read and understand the Bible and live that out. And then as I got older, seeing getting some education about other ways of thinking, other ancient books and scriptures, and seeing that there was no one set of divine rules or ideas handed to us, and that humanity in all times and places has been inspired by the divine and creating these books. So then I set out to find, well, what resonates with me the most, which books and thinkers and ideas resonate with me and apply the best to my life. And one of the big ones was the Stoic philosophers. At a time when I was going through divorce and was very stressed out, probably the low point of my life, that's when I started reading Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and really appreciated their message of letting go of things that we can't control. That's what it would take for me to get through each day, was reading a little of that and trying to put it into practice. And then I found later when I would recommend these books to others, other people would pick them up and perhaps be lost in the thick wording and not get the same value out of it that I got. So I decided I wanted to write my own paraphrase version of these books to help other people see what I saw in the books. And also because by reading these philosophers, whether it's Epictetus or Emerson, and writing my own version, that gives me the chance to really study them deeply. So I probably get more out of it than anyone.
One of the ideas that you have that I really like, and that's reflected, or the basis for living from the soul, seven spiritual principles of Ralph Waldo Emerson, is Emerson and all these guys, all the Stoics you mentioned, they're all really difficult to read. They have a way of writing which is very Latin and very convoluted. And Emerson also, he's difficult. And I appreciate someone who comes along and says, let's untangle the language here and say what it is he's saying for a modern audience. And you do that in that book. I really appreciate that. I think it's a great idea. I think we need something like that today. But you mentioned crisis. Let's talk about crisis, shall we? The Emerson went through a crisis and became Emerson on the other side of it. That's what, looking at his biography, that's what you would have to say. Could you explain that a little bit, or explain how you see that?
Around 1832, his wife died of tuberculosis, and she was quite young, I think only about 19 years old at the time. They had only been married a year or two. And so his wife died, and then he was increasingly having doubts about Christianity and what he was preaching every Sunday. He was working as a preacher, which his father and grandfather before him had been preachers, so that was sort of the family business. And he decided to resign from the church that he was preaching at. And then he didn't really know what he was going to do next. And he decided to travel to Europe and meet with some of his literary heroes, like Wordsworth and Carlyle. And it was really through that trip that he decided he would become a lecturer and an essayist, and not focusing on religious topics anymore, but taking the whole world as the Bible and sort of preaching about all aspects of life.
If he had not gone through this crisis of losing his religion and losing his family and kind of the whole purpose of life, would he have ever become Emerson?
I think he might have just stayed within the comfortable confines of the church and being a preacher. He would have certainly been a liberal preacher who was pushing the edges, as he did even in his sermons of the time. But I think that forced him to branch out into the wider world and to examine other traditions.
You said you went through a crisis with a divorce, which I'm sorry to hear that. And I know I go through a crisis all the time. My entire life is a crisis. And many of us now in COVID, of course, it is a crisis time. Looking at crisis, at your crisis, is it maybe even a good thing? I mean, besides the suffering of it, which is the suffering, of course, is real, but is it something that sometimes we need to go through in order to find something better on the other side?
Yeah, I think we do need to go through it, even though we don't want it, we wouldn't choose it. And even looking back, there are a lot of things I would not say, oh, I'm glad I went through that. But yet I can see all the benefits, how much further along I am in certain areas now. Yeah, and definitely I was shifting my ideas about Christianity at the same time that I was going through divorce. It's hard to say which came first in that. Probably the changing religious ideas came first. But those things definitely went hand in hand for me, where it was a total life crisis. Not just one of beliefs and intellect, but also a personal crisis at the same time.
Did you, lose your religion? Are you no longer a Christian, or what happened there?
I would say I'm no longer Christian, or in a sense, I'm an extremely liberal Christian, or I can appreciate parts of it now in that way without saying this is the one way. It's one of many ways that I respect, but it doesn't resonate with me as much as certain other things.
Do you believe in an actual God? And I ask that because I want to ask the same question about Emerson.
Yeah, I would say yes. But God is defined as a mystery beyond human understanding, beyond all our definitions. God is the source, the life force, the power behind the universe. Everything is an expression of God that exists.
I've always thought that if God does exist, there's no way we can understand him. It's way beyond.
So I would like to add, so what I lost, and it's not really lose, isn't really the right word perhaps, but I changed from a faith in a so-called personal God, where people think of God as having a lot of human characteristics. When you read the Bible, God is an old man who experiences jealousy and anger, very humanized portrayal of God. And then with Christianity, there's the portrayal that God was only incarnate one time as Jesus, a person who lived 2,000 years ago. So what changed for me was to stop seeing God in those human terms, those anthropomorphic terms, and rather as the source of everything.
Did Emerson believe in God?
I would say yes, and in the same way that I just explained it, as the source and power that expresses itself as our universe. He was certainly comfortable using the word God throughout his entire life.
Did he believe in creation, like God created us intentionally? And did he believe in some kind of afterlife? Or was his ideas about God and eternity more like Carl Sagan, who said, we're molecules, and molecules will still be, there is an afterlife, but in a different form, as molecules?
First off, in terms of creation, Emerson was far ahead of his time in being an evolutionary thinker. So he described all of life arising from, he called it a worm or a monad. So he imagined one small organism and all of life, including us, evolving from that. So he was decades ahead of Darwin even. And there were certainly other people ahead of Darwin. Darwin just showed the scientific mechanism by which this happens, but the idea of evolution preceded that. So he did not believe in a special creation of humanity, but I don't know if Emerson would say that sort of there was a plan, there was an intelligence planning creation so that humanity would evolve. We'd have to go back and ask him on that. And then, in terms of an afterlife, he certainly believed that spirit and consciousness go on, that they are immortal. But he seems to describe it more in terms of our soul and our consciousness blends back in to the oversoul, or the great universal soul. So he expressed being agnostic about whether our personal qualities would continue in an afterlife. But he certainly believed that our souls do continue.
That's probably, for me, the most fascinating question. I want to ask you about this one essay, this one, iconic essay that he wrote, The Oversoul, in a moment, what the soul is. That's really interesting to me. Let's get back to some of the basics again. What is transcendentalism?
Yes, Emerson defined transcendentalism as opposed to materialism. So he would say with materialism, the idea is that the physical world and matter is the primary thing that exists. And then mind and consciousness are sort of added, a little icing on the cake added to that. That's materialism. So he defined transcendentalism as that the mental and the spiritual are the foundation. The mental and the spiritual are primary. Those things have a real existence. And then matter is only a temporary expression arising from the mental and spiritual.
there's this idea in American culture where it mixes philosophy with the doctrine of success. Much of what America is about success. We come over from the old world where we didn't have as many opportunities, and here's a land of opportunity, and we can be successful. Usually that means money or celebrity or something like that. But you can define it as you want. But the doctrine of success seems very American to me. And if I got that correctly, Emerson is the one who said, build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. That seems to be like this doctrine of success, that he was also part of that. And one of the aspects of this doctrine of success is the law of attraction, which arose in the 19th century, where you say you think about something, and that what you think about will become true. You think and grow rich, right? That was the famous book about it. That was the 20th century, but it started in the 19th century. Was he kind of like, in a more spiritual way, part of that movement where the idea is the basis for everything, and it becomes a reality? And if you can change your thoughts, the way you think about yourself and your life, you can change your material, physical life?
Yes, I think he was the godfather of that, one of the originators of this idea of the primary importance of thought and the idea that as we think, so we attract into our lives. Or as we think, so we act, and then as we act, so we attract into our lives. That's exactly straight from Emerson. I think that some of his later disciples took that too far and distorted it in terms of, if you think about a car enough, you'll get a car. You'll get a new car, for example. So I think there's a distortion when it comes into applying it too much to material things, where with Emerson, it's really about character. It's our thoughts determine our character, and our character determines our lives. So I think it needs to be understood in terms of character rather than in terms of riches and material accumulation. But there's certainly, Emerson was not opposed to success, but he definitely stressed the moral aspect, and do what you're called to do what your talents are, and be the best at that. And then likely some material success will follow, but it might not. And it doesn't matter. I think that's what Emerson would say.
As an example, you just said, do what you're called to do. Who's calling us? Do we have a calling? That's actually very interesting. I'm not being sarcastic. It's interesting. What do you mean by that? Or what did he mean by that?
I think he would say the soul, or that our souls call us. And it can be hard to separate what is the soul and what is our personality, what is things that we learn in this life. But he definitely had a sense of sort of a personal angel guiding his way. And so I would say that calling comes from our soul.
There was three things I wanted to ask about transcendentalism. It was famously, whenever people talk about transcendentalism, they talk about the influence of the Bhagavad Gita. And as far as I can tell, there are three major influences, besides, of course, his own thinking and probably nature. But there's the Bhagavad Gita, there's Christianity, his Unitarianism, and there's Swedenborg, the Swedish philosopher who was very religious. He was almost like a prophet. Could you tell us what these influences are?
The Eastern influence, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. Emerson and Thoreau would read these in German translations. Thoreau might have learned Sanskrit. I'm not sure on that. With Emerson, he read these Eastern works in a German translation, and was one of the first Americans to read these works and to introduce them. He was also the first American to translate the poems of Hafiz. So he took a German translation of Hafiz, translated that into American. So the great Sufi poets that are very popular today, like Rumi and Hafiz, Emerson was one of the first Americans to discover them. So definitely a lot of influence. And when you go to ancient Indian philosophy, there is from the beginning the idea that there is one self, and they call it the self or consciousness, that then expresses itself as all of our individual consciousnesses are little drops in that ocean. And I think that, I don't know that Emerson picked that idea up from Indian philosophy or that he intuited it himself. I'm not sure. It could be a mix, but I certainly think he might have intuited that himself, and it just happened to resonate with what the ancient Indian philosophers had also felt.
If anyone were to ask me, I mean, of course, I'm obviously not an expert, but if anyone were to ask me what is transcendentalism, I would say, you should read this book by Sam Torode, Living from the Soul, 7 Spiritual Principles of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Can you tell me what these 7 principles, you've basically taken his philosophy or many parts of his philosophy and reduced it into 7 principles that are helpful for us today. Can you tell us what these 7 principles are? Or, people are supposed to read the book, so say maybe 3. But tell us what the book is about.
And I have to say, I've published a book at the start of 2020, recorded the audiobook later. I haven't reread it recently, so I often forget what's in my own books, and then I pick them up and think, wow, this is really good. Where did this come from? But partly because it's coming from Emerson, not all myself. But to read some of the principles, number 1 is trust yourself. All that you need for growth and guidance is inside you. And that reminds me, one of the things that drew me to Emerson was he wanted to get away from relying on tradition and instead have a direct relationship to God and to nature. And I think in my upbringing, it was our relationship was to the Bible. Then later I got very influenced by Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thinkers, and there the relationship is to the church. Your only relationship to God is being part of the church. So as I got older and grew out of that, I saw, well, we have to have a direct personal relationship or it's nothing. And so that's what Emerson says, is we need to trust ourselves and have a direct relationship to God and nature. Another of the principles is, as you sow, you will reap. And that's where Emerson believed that there were universal moral principles at work throughout the universe, and like a law of the universe. And he saw this as an expression of God, perhaps like the mind of God. We get an insight into that mind of God by observing the workings of these principles. And he didn't get bogged down in like the little rules of religion, like don't eat meat on Friday, or or there are so many, especially as you get into or sexual rules, in the Protestant and evangelical church, like you can't be gay or you're going to hell. He was not into that stuff at all. So to Emerson, one of the universal rules is, as you sow, you will reap, or as you give, you will get back. So that's an example of an important principle. Another of them is to live in the present as much as possible, to focus on the present moment and not get lost in regretting the past or worrying about the future. That we have our power to act and to choose is only right now in the present.
Thanks for that. All 7 principles are very interesting, by the way. You should check them out. Read the book. Get the book. It's cheap. It's short. It's easy to read. It's good. Get the book. Okay, good. So that's enough of that. One of the things that really fascinated me about Emerson is because it was similar to what you did. I had a crisis of faith, and I left my church, and I don't know now whether I really believe in God or not. It's kind of going back and forth, and that fascinated me. But it also fascinated me that he started out on a track to a Unitarian minister, and he was for a while, and then he kind of made his own thoughts and developed a kind of a theology or a philosophy, as transcendentalism is a philosophy of his own. And it seemed to me like you grow up in a church and you're told that this is the truth because it's in the Bible. And people, the prophets before you have said it's the truth. Therefore, it's the truth. And you cannot question it because the people who know told you that it's the truth. It's like the people who know, this. You don't question how a combustion engine works because someone who knows how it works tells you how it works. And you don't say, well, I'm gonna make my own combustion engine. You don't do that. But he took religion and he was in the church and he said, well, yeah, but I would prefer a different kind of religion. And it seemed to me that he created, to express it kind of radically, he created his own God in a sense. Is that allowed? Can everyone, each of us, even those of us who are not geniuses, can we create our own God?
I would say he wasn't creating his own God so much as realizing that he could directly tap into God in the same way that the prophets of the Old Testament had done, or the ancient Indian sages. And as each person taps into God or receives inspiration, it's filtered through their culture. So the ancient Hebrews are going to come up with certain things peculiar to them, or write a psalm about being the shepherd leading the sheep to the cool water. So that's very much rooted in that sheep herding culture. So what Emerson said is, instead of relying on these ancient sheep herders and just repeating their words, I can be just as inspired as they were. And I can see what message does God have for me today in this culture.
Well, but when you say I can be just as inspired, I can see what message God has for us today, do you mean Emerson could do that because he was a genius? Or do you mean I can do that because I'm just a normal guy?
I think he would say we all can. It's something that we can all develop our intuition, and we can all receive inspiration. I think certainly some people are more inspired, but we're all capable of inspiration, but some are more inspired. It's like in terms of artists, we can all have fun drawing, but we're not all going to be Andrew Wyeth.
How would you go about, I guess you're saying creating your own God is the wrong, but becoming a prophet, your own prophet. How would you come about it? If he was an example, what would I do to kind of, I make contact with my own God, to make contact myself with God and nature for my own personal life? What would I do? What are 2 or 3 things I could do?
Yes, I would say spending time in nature is a big part of it, just quiet and observing, because he would say nature is an expression of God. It's a direct symbol of God. So spending time in nature. And then even reading what others have written and said, the inspirations of others, that was a part of what Emerson practiced and believed in. He just felt we shouldn't rely on that completely, but it's a part of it, because he believed we're all connected. All humanity is connected, so it is good to learn what did the ancient Hebrews think? What did the Indians think? What do people today think? And then another would be meditation. Definitely that would be a very important thing to Emerson and what we can do today. I don't think he meditated in the way of the way we might think of it today, of sitting down in the lotus position and waiting for a blank mind. But I think he would have endorsed that if he had known about it. But I think most of his meditation came when he was in nature. either walking or sitting.
How did he do that? How did he commune with nature? Was it some kind of, did he happen to, walk through a park going to work every day? Or did he have a time where he said, every Sunday I'm alone and I'm going into the woods and I'm going to stay there for 2 hours and come back? What was his method?
Yeah, I think he walked a great deal, both alone and with companions. Like he went on many walks with Henry David Thoreau, and they would talk or observe things, share observations on the plants and such. But there was and I visited his house in Concord, Massachusetts a few years ago, and there was a path from his house to Walden Pond of probably a 2-mile walk or so, and he would walk that path very frequently. And he owned the property on Walden Pond that he let Henry David Thoreau build that cabin on, where he wrote Walden.
Well, yeah, I've always thought, I could have been Thoreau if I'd had a friend like Emerson.
And I'll also say there's in the book Nature, which was Emerson's first book, a little thin one, I've put out an edition that I designed that has photographs in it and such. In that book, he describes a mystical experience where he walks to the top of a hill and he's looking out at the countryside, and he says, "I became like an all-seeing eyeball." So he felt his body disappear, his personal self disappear, and felt he was just conscious and observing all of nature. And that's something that's very similar to what the Eastern philosophers describe and the Buddhists describe about meditation. So I think he reached that same state.
Do you think have we lost that today? I mean, I got to admit, I don't read many modern poets. And a lot of what we think and do today is kind of like a back to nature. We want to eat organically. We want to save the planet from climate change. There's all that stuff. So we're dealing with nature in a certain way all the time in our lives. But I don't see many people taking long walks in nature and coming back and describing a metaphysical transformation or anything like that. That doesn't seem modern to me. Have we lost that?
I think we have lost it to a great extent. And we might take a camping trip to a special place, but it's not part of our everyday lives. And I was commenting to my wife the other day that I think before electricity, people would have had a mystical experience every night when they looked up at the stars, because it's when you're in a spot where there's no light pollution, it's such a powerful experience to look up at the stars. And I remember when I was still in the Christian church, the only real spiritual or mystical experience I ever had was looking up at the stars and just having a sense of the vastness of God. So I think that even that is something that we've lost, that we don't have those daily experiences. And I think computers, the internet is definitely a blessing and a curse. I mean, I make my living off the internet. I'm able to speak with people like you on the internet. But on the other hand, I spend so much time distracted following political news and getting sucked into little controversies. So, yeah, technology definitely a blessing and a curse. And I think it's taken away a lot of our opportunities for mystical experiences.
Let's talk about briefly here about these two iconical essays that he wrote. The essays were based on lectures, or the lectures were based on essays, or both?
Yeah, usually his essays would come out of his lectures. So he would lecture about something for a while to work out his thoughts, and then he would sit down and write the final essay.
And I think you said in a different interview, you said that there's some kind of a progression or a relationship between his journal thoughts and then the lecture and then the essay, which I guess was very tighter and more. Can you say something about his process, about his thinking, writing process?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. he would journal every day. So he would first start developing the ideas in his journal. Then he would piece together those ideas into a lecture. And then he would sit down and really polish it into an essay.
The essay Nature, was probably his first big hit, I guess, right?
By hit, I think it only sold about 1,000 copies.
Okay. Well, okay. Wait, but let's make a little footnote here. He found a way to earn money and make a living by writing essays, selling books, and by lecturing. I think, is it true that lecturing was his main source of income?
Definitely the lecturing. He also, when his first wife died of tuberculosis, he inherited some money from her family that helped him until he got the lecturing established.
Yeah, as a writer, and you know yourself, it's tough to live from writing. So marrying well is probably a good idea for a writer. Okay, Nature. What is the central theme? What is he talking about here in the book, in the essay Nature?
The part I love, I remember in high school reading it, and what grabbed me is this idea of letting go of the dead traditions of the past and seeking to establish a direct relationship to God and to nature. So that in particular is what impressed me the first time I read it, even though I disagreed with that at the time, and I really wrestled with Emerson and considered myself opposed to his ideas because I was all about the tradition of the church, and I felt that so it really took years and maturity for me to start being able to grasp Emerson and understand what he meant about the limitations of tradition and how ultimately we need that direct relationship. I'm just picking up the book here. He says, "The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe?" So he's saying, why can't we be like them instead of just repeating their words and following them?
Okay, that's beautiful. It goes back to the idea of kind of being your own prophet, making your own connection. And he's saying you make a connection kind of with God or the universe via nature.
As I flip through the rest of the book here, he talks about how our ideas of beauty are learned from nature. So aesthetics, human standards of beauty, he believes that nature is where we learn that, and that human art and architecture can mimic the patterns of nature. Those are the most pleasing things to us, which is why like a concrete block building is not a good idea. It's not going to nourish us because it's not mimicking the organic patterns of nature. Another favorite part of that book for me is he talks about language and how the further back we go looking at the evolution of language, the first written works are in pictures, like the hieroglyphics. They're very natural forms or even depictions of animals and such. And when you look at ancient Chinese characters, they're often gestures that you can see trees and people in there. So he speaks about how language comes from nature, and that as we've gone along, language is more and more distant and abstracted from nature, and how there can actually be drawbacks to that, and it's good to get back to a more natural a language that's more in touch with nature.
Yeah, the other iconic, or one that is most interesting to me, and you touched on it earlier, and I think the whole discussion of transcendentalism touches on it, is the oversoul. What is the oversoul? What did he mean by that, and why is that important?
The universal soul, the source of everything, and he described it as a print where the soul is like a linograph print, where that's the original, and then that nature is an impression or expression of the soul. Nature is the visible, The material world is the visible expression of the soul. And what interests me is how quantum physics, modern physics, is sort of going in this direction now, where we've always thought of matter as being hard and real. And what modern physics is now telling us is that everything is energy. And what we think of as solid matter is just a very fast vibration of invisible energy. Everything that we think of, colors, textures, feeling, it's all energy at different vibrations. And I think that really ties in nicely with Emerson's belief that the soul is the universal soul, or oversoul is the source of everything. Today we might use the word consciousness more often, that consciousness is the foundation, the source. And we've learned, what we think of, as a color is in a sense an illusion. It's something we perceive in consciousness, but it's not a reality in itself. So I think of just the genius of the ancient Indian philosophers and up through Emerson, who intuited these things without the scientific knowledge. That amazes me.
Is the idea that we as human beings, or our consciousness, or our physical beings even, is an expression of a central soul, some kind of overriding soul?
All human beings are ultimately connected in that soul, part of that soul and expressions of it, and all of animals and nature. And Emerson actually seemed to believe in aliens on other planets as well.
Oh, I like him already.
So they would be part of that. They would be expressions of that soul too. But he actually, in one of his last sermons, he speaks of that there might be beings on Venus and Mars and Mercury who would have very different physical characteristics from us because of the different atmospheres of those planets. And he said if you transported the Bible to those planets, the epistles of Paul would be absolutely unintelligible to them. Like all of the historical aspects of the Bible, the Palestinian, the Jewish, the things happening in those places would make no sense. But he believed that the moral law, such as you sow, you will reap, that would apply on Mars and Venus.
That's interesting. So these are so some universal thing, and he would see the theoretical aliens on Mars and Venus as being also part of the same oversoul. So it's not an oversoul of Earth, an oversoul of Mars, an oversoul of Venus, but a universal existence that is connected.
Yeah.
Well, how does the relationship between the individual soul and the oversoul work? Do I have an individual soul, or is it only the soul that I think of as my soul, an aspect of a greater soul? I'm just sharing it. I'm kind of wanting to pretend that it's mine and doesn't belong to anyone else, but in fact, it's not mine.
Yeah, that's something I've wrestled with, both figuring out what I think and what Emerson thought, because it's not entirely clear. But he spoke of our individual souls as inlets of the oceanic oversoul, like where the water touches the shore, every spot is different. So in a sense, I think he leaned toward more we're borrowing our soul for a time. It's being filtered through our DNA, our place in time, our parents, our culture. That our individuality is more of a temporary thing, and that we will melt back into the oversoul. Although he does say that all of the love and goodness that we experience and we create, that's not lost, that somehow endures. I mean, he does speak of that. I believe he was agnostic about reincarnation. I think the idea of the oversoul certainly lends itself to reincarnation, that we would meld back in and then come back out. But whether whether there's a sense of an individual soul reincarnating over and over, I'm not sure he would agree with that, or more that it's the oversoul continually incarnating in different forms. So I think that's something we have to die to know the answer. We can't know the answer while we're alive.
Thanks for that. I'm really looking forward to that. This reminds me of, there's a quote, I used to have it on a T-shirt, a quote by Carl Sagan. He said, we are expressions of the universe come together to form a life for a short time, or something like that. And he's talking about on a physical level, where the molecules of the universe come together, they form, Sam, Eric, a car, and then they disperse again and form something else. So it's like, it's interesting. The way you describe him in the Oversoul has interesting parallels to science.
I like to look at all these principles because I'm naturally pretty skeptical, or I have a skeptical side. I like to look at them in that scientific way and also in the spiritual way. So, and that's one of Emerson's principles in the book Living from the Soul, is that the universe is inside you, or that we are expressions of the universe. So exactly like the Carl Sagan idea. And you can look at it scientifically in terms of we are made, every molecule in us, every atom in us pre-existed in the universe, going back to the Big Bang even, or was in the stars and formed molecules. The stars exploded and that forms Earth, and then we grow organically out of Earth. So in that sense, we can see how scientifically we're connected to all things, and we are expressions of the universe. And then you can also look at that in a spiritual or religious sense, and say, well, if we define God as the source of all that exists, then we are, what else could we be but expressions of God?
When I asked this question, you said it's hard to express exactly what Emerson thought and what you thought. Do you think or feel a little bit different? Can I talk, you're paraphrasing, the books you're writing, you're kind of paraphrasing and talking about other philosophers. Yet you have your own, you're also kind of a philosopher, you're a writer, you have your own thoughts. Can you tell me what you think about the soul or life? What were you thinking when I asked how does Emerson see this, and you said, well, Emerson sees it a certain way, I see it a slightly different way. What were you thinking?
I meant in that case, I'm trying to figure out what I think, like as far as the individual soul question versus the oversoul. Is the individual soul have some sort of immortal existence? So I'm saying that I wouldn't necessarily agree with Emerson, or I would be violating his principles if I said I can only agree with what Emerson said and I can't have my own opinion. But I do tend to agree with everything Emerson said about these topics, or he's the guide that I most resonate with.
Do you have specific or kind of even fuzzy ideas about the individual soul?
I guess I'm a little agnostic about whether after death my individual soul continues, or does it melt back into the ocean of the universal soul. Maybe it depends on the day in which I believe. Now, I have spoken with, for my podcast, I interviewed a man named David Ditchfield, who had a very powerful near-death experience where he was dragged under a train, and basically when he got to the hospital, basically he died. His consciousness went into the afterlife type realm, and he experienced that, as his individual self, and had an amazing experience, and then came back into his body. And I'm fascinated by stories like that, and I've listened to interviews and read books by other people who've had near-death experiences. So in those cases, they do describe, in a sense, their individual soul traveling on into that afterlife realm. So who knows? I think it's a mystery, but it's exciting. I'm more I'm more confident than I used to be. I would say, like when I was first losing my faith in Christianity, I would have been more atheistic or more scared of, more feeling that this might be the end, that nothing continues, and therefore, how could this life be worth anything, or how could we have meaning here if it all just is going to end? I have a sense of the mystery now, but also more confidence that it's all good. that what's going to follow death is better than what we could expect, I think.
You said you used to think, there is no meaning, this very nihilistic, fashionable nihilistic idea about life and death and the cold universe. But now you don't anymore. What? And we talked in the beginning, we talked about meaning. We're coming to the end here. Let's go full circle. Meaning of life or purpose of life or the experience of life. How do you see that? What meaning does life have for you? Or what is the mystery, the experience of life for you?
So first off, describing how I was more afraid, I think, or more doubting and believing that, materialism might be the truth, that the material world is all that exists. Everything else is kind of an illusion. And I had to follow what resonates with me as far as guides, and Emerson certainly became central. He's not preaching any kind of dogma, but his ideas that just appealed and seemed to make sense to me. And then others, I became interested in the near-death experiences, like I said, and it does seem there's something there. And there are books written from a scientific perspective even that argue logically that materialism is not, the final word of things. For example, what I was saying with quantum physics, that everything is energy. And a lot of science, I think, has been so focused on the material world and the evolution of that this is a new exciting idea that everything is energy, and we haven't fully integrated that into the sciences yet. Then, as far as my personal meaning, I think a Joseph Campbell quote has often meant a lot to me, where he says, we're not looking for the meaning of life so much as the experience of life. And I think that when we feel fulfilled and we feel on track and we feel good emotionally, then we don't sit around worrying about, what does this mean? That we enjoy it. And that's maybe the meaning is to enjoy it. There's Ray Bradbury said that the meaning of life is to witness and celebrate. I thought that's a fascinating answer.
That's a beautiful answer, yeah.
For me personally, my strongest mystical experiences or spiritual experiences have come through ceremonies with plant medicines or psychedelic plant medicines.
When you say plant medicine, you mean we're talking about marijuana here? We're talking about illegal drugs here? What is a plant medicine?
No, I've actually never smoked marijuana, which makes me kind of an oddball there. But the one I've had the most experience with is called ayahuasca. It's from the South American shamanic tradition, and it's a mixture of two plants, a vine and a leaf. Yeah, it's something that shamans in South America have been using for thousands of years. And it's just becoming available, elsewhere in the world right now. And basically, I think what these substances, these psychedelics do is they lower our logical mind. And they open up the subconscious and our emotions. And then we experience spirit, in that space. Once we quiet the logical, rational mind, then the spiritual realm just opens up. That's always there. We become aware of it. So for me personally, my strongest, what I would call a mystical or spiritual experience, have come through these ayahuasca ceremonies.
It's strange that we have to reach kind of our spiritual selves. We have to
fight back this materialistic self that we've created.
And I'll say, I think some people have an easier time quieting the rational mind and getting in that space. For someone like me who's very rational and skeptical, as I was saying, it's harder, more difficult. And like we discussed, in this modern world, we're so information focused that, every day we have to focus on our bank accounts, our bills, our work, different things. So it takes something radical for us to be able to let go of that rational mind and relax into the spiritual realm.
Taking all you know about Emerson, all the thoughts you've been making, is there one thing that our listeners can do in their normal daily lives to make their life better?
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind in the book, Secrets of the Mind, there's an essay paraphrased by me, but from an essay of Emerson about inspiration, ways we can become more open to inspiration. And he offers several ideas in there. One is to write letters to people and engage in quality conversations. So when we write letters, it's a good way to find out what we think. And seeking solitude and spending time in nature. I think that you asked for one thing. That's probably what I would put as number one, is spend more time in nature and time alone, meditating. He says to keep mornings sacred. I know that's it's great advice. It's often hard to do. I have the temptation a lot of days to just go check Twitter and see what's going on in the news, and that's not a good way to start the day. But keeping the mornings sacred by reading a good book, I think, is a great thing. He would suggest that. Yeah, spending time in nature and taking a retreat. He says sometimes what we need is a change of scenery. When you get to a new location, you might have new thoughts.
Okay, those are like 5 or 6 things, but they're all really good. What can I say?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Sam Torode. Oh, no, wait a minute. Is it Torode or Torode? I keep saying Torode. I want to say Torode. Something in the back of my mind is saying Torode. Why is that?
Yeah, so that I was very proud to find out when I was researching the name Torode that it originates from the Isle of Guernsey, which is where Henry David Thoreau's family originated from, and that the Torodes and the Thoreaus were originally one family. If you go back to the 1400s, it was called the Thorodes, and then they diverged at some point. So I'm certainly not a close relative of Henry David Thoreau, but I will gladly claim him as a cousin.
Claim him as a cousin. He's a great cousin to claim. Sam Torode, thank you so much. Author of Living from the Soul, the 7 Spiritual Principles of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Author and host of the podcast, Living from the Soul. We didn't talk about the music, but he's also a musician. You're a writer. You have several books about Emerson out there, several books about other philosophers. The website, how do you spell your website?
So samtorode.com, SAMTORODE.com.
One word, no dash.
Yes.
Sam, thank you so much for being there. All the best to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Great to meet you.
E.T. Hansen, that's me, is an American writer from Hawaii living in Berlin. I write novels and nonfiction in German and English. I teach the art of fiction, and I podcast about life and language and seeking wisdom. For more information, check out our publishing website, hulaink.com. That's Hula like the dance, INK like the printed page, in one word, hulaink.com. The music in this video was performed by our producer and editor, Lothar Rosengarten. Lothar is a musician who lives and performs in Berlin. For more information about him, please visit his website, lothar-rosengarten.de. That's LOTHAR-ROSENGARTEN.de. You can support Hula Inc. and Lothar and me by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Hula Inc. And don't forget to share our videos and our podcasts and subscribe to this podcast and to vimeo.com/Hula Inc. But mostly we just hope that you enjoy and have something from our work. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. And we wish you all the love, luck, and happiness in this world.